is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to Global Business Europe, live from CGTN in London. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Juliet Mann. Our top stories. The coronavirus scare at the G7. India pulls out of face-to-face talks in London after 2 of its delegation test positive.
Our other headlines: Brussels denies the EU-China investment deal has been suspended over sanctions and worsening relations with Beijing.
Why Paris is threatening to cut electricity supplies to a small island between France and Britain.
Still blocked, Facebook continues Donald Trump's suspension, at least for now.
And Home Sweet Home, Europe's first 3D printed house, welcomes its first tenants.
The group of 7 foreign ministers meeting in London has been hit by a COVID-19 scare after 2 Indian delegates tested positive for coronavirus. The entire Indian team is now self-isolating.
This as the battle against COVID-19 takes centre stage at the talks, with today's discussions focused on providing fairer access to vaccines. Let's talk to our correspondent, Andrew Wilson, in Oxford. Andrew, how worrying is this? I mean, have other delegates from other countries been exposed to the virus?
Who knows, but probably not. Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, his team put out a message this morning saying we're satisfied that the distancing measures are appropriate and that we're not concerned that this is a problem for the other delegations, and so agreed to carry on face-to-face talks, and all the other G7 members and their guests as well went ahead with talks. Dr. Jaishankar, the foreign minister from India, is now in self-isolation and only able to participate in the talks remotely. It does seem that 2 of his team did test positive for the COVID virus when on departure from India a few days ago they had tested negative. Now, that's a comment either on the effectiveness of tests, which we know do have a fairly high failure rate from time to time, or of course it's of the virus making its presence felt within a patient a little later on after the infection starts. What is interesting, of course, it immediately casts a shadow over the whole proceedings. Only 2 days ago, UK scientists were saying they think lockdowns are over for the UK, that we have, with our vaccination programme, made enough progress towards guaranteeing a certain amount of safety going forwards. And then 2 people come from a country that, as we all know, is in dire straits at the moment with its COVID infections, and the whole thing goes up a level of alert again. But I do think it's a disappointment for the Indians. A lot of progress was being made. Dr. Jaishankar met Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, yesterday. Quite a lot of progress made on mutual visa exchanges between the UK and India. But nonetheless, that has to now be the case. He can only talk to people through a screen until he departs.
So COVID's still very much the hot topic. But on this last day of the meeting, what else has been discussed?
Well, the agenda's been extremely full. If you think only a few years ago when the G7 got together, they discussed interest rates, they discussed money supply, and often didn't go much further than that. This time, after a 2-year absence from meeting each other, the agenda has been packed. To give you an example, they've been talking about open societies, press freedom, arbitrary detention. They talked again at length about vaccines and global health today, about climate change, of course. A lot of groundwork being laid for the climate discussions in November in Glasgow. They talked about famine prevention, humanitarian crises, and also the rights of women and gender inequalities around the world. So those were the main plenary agendas. But at the same time, I just made a note before talking to you now of the bilateral talks that were taking place today. UK talking to the Foreign Minister of Brunei, Australia's Foreign Minister talking to Japan, Italy talking to France, UK private talks with Germany, and the European Union private talks with South Korea, not to mention Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, who's talked to almost everyone privately. It's been a real chance for, after an extended period of absence, for the US particularly to get back in the room with people and start sounding them out about how they feel about the hot-button issues of the day, which are, of course, deteriorating relations with Moscow, climate change, and also the prospect of the growing economic power of China and how the world is prepared to deal with that, accommodate that, or push back against. They still haven't really made a clear unanimous decision, but everyone will have been talking about these issues, and for the first time since this pandemic started a year and a half to 2 years ago, chance to look each other in the eye and really get a feeling about whether or not it's realistic to suggest about working together in multilateral groups going forwards. Expect the Americans also now to announce what they're going to call a democracy summit, a group of like-minded leaders to gather in Washington at some time this year, and also a meeting of what they're now calling the Quad, which is representatives from the United States, Japan, Australia and India, all from that Indo-Pacific region, to also meet and sort of classify themselves as another group outside the G7. So there's lots of ground being laid for a busy year ahead. And bear in mind, this is just the foreign ministers. We do this all again in June in Cornwall in the southwest of the UK, when the leaders of the G7 countries come together again, hosted by Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister.
So more than a dress rehearsal. Andrew Wilson, thanks very much.
The European Union has denied reports that it's shelving efforts to pass a massive investment deal signed with China last year. The EU's Trade Commissioner was quoted as saying the environment is not conducive to the ratification of the agreement. But the EU spokesperson says Valdis Dombrovskis' remarks were taken out of context. Well, let's talk to our correspondent Tony Waterman watching the story in Brussels. Tony, what has and what has not been said?
Well, Brussels seems to be throwing some cold water on this story. As you just mentioned there, the Trade Commissioner Dombrovskis was quoted in an AFP article on Tuesday night saying that, in a sense, that certain efforts to ratify this investment deal had been suspended, but his communications advisor clarifying that and saying that technical work is still ongoing. This is stuff like the legal review or the translation of the text, and that there had been no formal suspension decision that had been made. But Dombrovskis was very clear in that interview and also today during a press conference that the ratification process cannot be separated from the wider dynamics of the EU-China relationship. In March, there was a tit-for-tat sanctions that were dispensed. First came from Brussels, who slapped those sanctions on 4 Chinese officials and one entity that it believed were involved in alleged human rights violations in Xinjiang. Beijing was quick to fire back. It dispensed its own set of sanctions on 10 individuals. That included 5 members of the European Parliament. But take a listen to what Dombrovskis had to say earlier on this topic.
Technical work is ongoing to prepare the ground for ratification. However, once again, I would repeat that the ratification process cannot be separated from evolving dynamics of the wider EU-China relationship. And in this context, Chinese retaliatory sanctions targeting, among others, members of European Parliament and even entire parliamentary subcommittee are unacceptable and regrettable. And prospects and next steps concerning the ratification on comprehensive agreement of investment will depend on how the situation evolves.
Well, it's a public holiday in China, so we haven't had an official response from the government yet on this interview. But in the past, Beijing has really touted the benefits of this investment deal, which would unlock investment opportunities for both sides. It would help level the playing field and for fair competition. And actually, Chancellor Angela Merkel, who was a driving force behind getting this deal agreed to in principle in late December, said today that despite some of the issues when it comes to ratification, that this was still a worthwhile endeavor because it would provide reciprocity for European businesses. But she also said that some of the issues that Europe has with China, including human rights, still need to be addressed.
Tony, the EU has also unveiled plans to cut reliance in key industries on foreign suppliers. Can you tell us which countries are affected by this?
Well, it seems that China might end up being the most most impacted country from this new regulation, because it is one of the largest trading partners for Europe. It's a major supplier, especially in these critical industries and for critical products. What Brussels wants to do is limit its exposure when it comes to 6 strategic industries. This includes batteries, semiconductors, pharmaceutical ingredients, and also cloud technology. These are industries that really underpin the bloc's green and digital goals, and also play a very outsized role when it comes to the bloc's COVID-19 recovery plans. And they're planning to do an in-depth review of the supply chains, but already they have identified 137 critical products that they say are very important to industry, that they're strategic, and over half of them come from China. A very distant second is Vietnam, and a very, very distant third is Brazil. So China really has potentially a lot to lose here. They're going to try to reduce their dependency. They said that they could perhaps try to build out these industries a bit closer to home, or they could even start stockpiling some of these products. But it was a very, very busy day here in Brussels, because they also unveiled plans to start restricting foreign takeovers from companies who are receiving state-backed subsidies. This is something that they have been pushing for and working towards for a very long time now. It would give them the power to investigate these companies and also potentially block these deals. There could be fines if these companies do not participate or go along with these investigations of up to 10% of their global turnover. Now, the Commission didn't name any country or single out any country, but it is also thought that China could be impacted by this as well.
Tony Waterman in Brussels, thank you very much.
Tough coronavirus curbs in Germany are entering their 6th month, but there may be some relief for people who are fully vaccinated. The Parliament's poised to loosen restrictions on going out to eat or travelling for those fully vaccinated. But there are worries that those under 50 who could be months away from getting a first dose will lose out. Ryan Thompson reports.
Every day, more and more Germans are getting vaccinated against COVID-19. Last Wednesday, more than 1 million people were inoculated in a single day, and that's an EU record that's expected to be topped again this week. But this is coinciding with a fierce new debate in Germany. Should the fully vaccinated be able to live life with a different rule book, as in far fewer coronavirus restrictions? It seems the government and Chancellor Angela Merkel think so, and this week they've been moving legislation forward that would give the vaccinated part of the population an easier time. The fully vaccinated, as in those with 2 shots, would be largely exempt from travel quarantines. They could go to places without having to present a negative test. And the legal logic here is that these people no longer pose a threat to public health and can't be subject to restrictions on their fundamental rights, according to the Justice Minister. Of course, there is still a lot of progress to be made in Germany's vaccination campaign, and many worry that this may discriminate against young people who have been patiently waiting for their turn, which may not come for a few more months. Many states are now in phase 3, which does include more of the population under 60, people with high-risk jobs or medical conditions. But the full opening of the vaccine calendar won't be until early June, and at that point, it's sure that getting an appointment may take a few tries. Germany's parliament will debate this legislation on Thursday and is expected to bring it to a vote by the end of the day. Though it does have its critics, it's expected that this piece of law will pass and should be in place by the weekend. Ryan Thompson, CGTN, Frankfurt.
And staying in Germany, the government there has announced more ambitious plans to cut greenhouse gases. The new target of a 65% cut in carbon emissions by the year 2030 and 88% by 2040 has been prompted by a court ruling which said the government failed to set out how it would cut greenhouse gases after 2030. It also comes as the opposition Green Party takes the lead in polls ahead of September elections.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, the US Treasury Secretary downplays her comments after wobbling the markets. We're live in New York.
Search CGTN Europe wherever you get your podcasts to subscribe to the Agenda podcast. The Agenda with me, Stephen Cole, always gets to the heart of the story. Just subscribe today and listen now.
Covering the world from 4 continents. A new horizon. Teams in Beijing, Washington, D.C., Nairobi, and London, who connect, interact, and inquire to bring you the stories that matter to all. The Link, only on CGTN. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities. Reinvent. Find new opportunities. Discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe, live from London. A quick reminder, CGTN is available free on all of the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online, on Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, on YouTube and Dailymotion, as well as CGTN.com and the CGTN app. Now, in Spain, the right-wing Popular Party has won a resounding victory in Madrid's regional elections.
But the party didn't win enough seats to claim a majority and will have to deal with the far-right Vox party to form a government. Rahul Pathak reports.
Jubilant scenes at the Madrid headquarters of Isabel Ayuso's right-wing Popular Party. Their victory in Tuesday's regional election saw the PP double their share of the votes, the party winning 65 seats in Madrid's 136-seat assembly, falling just short of an overall majority. The win a personal triumph for Madrid's outspoken leader after she called a snap election back in March.
Thanks for making history. Today we start a new chapter in Spain's history, because today from Madrid and from kilometre zero, we're going to recover our pride, our sense of belonging and the culture of hard work, and especially our coexistence, plus the unity and freedom that Spain needs.
It wasn't such a good night for Ayuso's former coalition partners, the centrist Citizens Party. They lost all 26 of their seats and will have no representation in the new assembly. It's yet another sign that politics in Spain is becoming ever more polarised. There was also a spectacular fall from grace for Pablo Iglesias, the candidate for the hard-left Podemos. The man who was deputy to Pedro Sanchez just a few months ago is now out of politics for good after his party came in 5th in terms of voter share.
I'm very proud to have served as Vice President of the government, but when you're no longer useful, you have to know how to retire.
Now, while it was a bad night for those parties with a moderate message, for the far-right Vox party, their 13 seats in the new assembly means they're almost certain to throw their support behind Ayuso's PP, which means the balance of power in Madrid will have moved firmly to the right, which in turn will have a knock-on effect on the national government of Pedro Sanchez.
Will there be a more moderate leadership coming in? That's probably likely, given the disaster in Madrid, which could mean that, Sanchez will move a little closer to the center. And I think that's probably what the voters are going to want. I think he'll read that signal and the policies could shift.
Fortunately for Pedro Sanchez, the next general election is still over 2 years away, giving him enough time to turn things around. But given the tribal nature of Spanish politics, that will not be easy. Rahul Pathak, CGTN, Madrid.
Let's look at financial markets. There's earnings season's in full swing here in Europe, and it's proving to be a blockbuster. A host of companies are smashing expectations as the continent continues to recover from the pandemic. Let's start with the automotive sector and the car giant Stellantis. They've posted a 14% jump in revenue, and that's just during the first quarter. Shares in the company, of course, is the big merger of Peugeot, Chrysler, Fiat Chrysler. They rose more than 3% in Paris. But they also warned of a global shortage of semiconductor chips that are now crucial to car design, and that could last into next year. On to shipping now, and revenues at the world's biggest freight company, Maersk, jumped a massive 30%. Now, the firm says it benefited from huge demand and a shortage of containers. Now, shares in the Danish company rose more than 5% in Copenhagen. And here in the UK, the online fashion retailer Boohoo posted a whopping 41% increase in revenue. Now, e-commerce, as we know, has been doing well in lockdowns, unlike so many of its bricks and mortar peers. But the company has faced severe scrutiny over its supply chain and workers' rights. Susanna Streeter is a senior investment analyst at the British investment platform Hargreaves Lansdown. She joins us now. Thanks for coming on the programme. Let's start with Boohoo, because they're diversifying. They've been on their own shopping spree, haven't they? And looking at the share price, it's almost as if investors have put ethical sourcing and supply chain issues into the save for later basket.
Well, yes, certainly Boohoo really has strutted ahead with growth. As you pointed out, we've had this huge surge in revenue, and it means that profits have ticked up by 35% to £124.7 million. And certainly it's because the platform was already so well set up for this accelerated shift to digital. But adding to that, of course, during the lockdowns, people shifted to buying loungewear and so didn't return so much stuff as they usually did, and that certainly helped margins as well. But yes, you mentioned ESG, and this is absolutely key because Boohoo was mired in a supply chain scandal and really promised to clean up its act after poor working conditions were discovered at factories in Leicester in England. And I think it's this ethical issue that really has been weighing on investors' minds, because despite this really accelerated growth, we've seen the share price off a little bit over recent months since this scandal erupted, and shares fell today despite these bumper numbers. So ESG really at the forefront of investors' minds.
Let's stick with talking about the supply chain issues, because we look at Maersk, the Danish group. They had their biggest quarter, the strongest quarterly profit, I think, in their 117-year history. But warnings of bottlenecks, warnings also of high freight rates going through the rest of this year.
Yes, certainly. The bottlenecks, though, seem to be really helping Maersk. The very fact that there is such high demand for goods with the rebound, the economic rebound that we're seeing, huge demand for goods, particularly from China coming into the United States. And there are these bottlenecks, these supply issues, waits of around 16 days, for example, to get into the port of Los Angeles. And really, Maersk is benefiting from this because it owns around 1 in 5 containers that are currently out there on the seas. And so given this huge demand, isn't likely to fall off anytime soon. In fact, Maersk says that it expects really strong demand to continue until at least the end of the year. We're unlikely to see much relief on those bottlenecks, and so it's going to take longer to wait for the goods that you're ordering, because already we're seeing really significant waiting times stretching out simply because of the really high demand. So of course a rebound in economic activity does always come with a bit of a cost.
Well, talking about high demand and something that's very necessary, of course, the semiconductor chips, something that the car industry really relies on. Still trying to get my head around Stellantis, this name of this great big car conglomerate, if you like. Have they got the chip shortage under control?
Well, certainly it's been really difficult for the company, but still they've managed to post really resilient figures today, up 14% revenues were, and that was pretty impressive given the fact that, say, 8 out of their 44 production sites really were idle because of these chip shortages. But what the company did is really focus on the models that certainly provide it with higher margins, and that certainly meant that revenues could keep piling in. It did warn, though, that actually the chip shortage might become even worse over the next 3 months compared to the first quarter of this year. And what's happening is the very fact that there's been a huge demand for electronic goods during the pandemic as people have shifted to working from home, a surge in the use of IT equipment. And then, of course, with the vaccine breakthroughs, we saw consumer confidence return and more people wanting to invest in a car once more. And so then there was an uptick in car sales as well. And so altogether, there's been this huge demand on chips and this shortage. And so I do think it's going to still weigh on car producers over the months to come.
Susanna Street, a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Nearly 40 of the UK's top food companies have threatened to cut trade ties with Brazil over proposed land reform in the Amazon. The group, which includes supermarkets Sainsbury's and the Co-op, has written to Brazilian lawmakers calling for them to reject a bill that would legalise the private occupation of public land in the Amazon. It's feared these plans could accelerate deforestation. The UK's biggest retailer says it'll boost its range of healthy food and drinks after coming under pressure from its shareholders. The supermarket giant Tesco said it aims to increase revenues from the sale of healthy products to 65% of total revenues from 2025. India's government has announced it will allow 5G trials over the next 6 months, but notably excluded Chinese tech giant Huawei from the list of equipment makers taking part. It comes amid tense relations between India and China following border disputes and the banning of some Chinese apps. China's Vice Commerce Minister Jiang Xianchen is among 4 new Deputy Director Generals of the World Trade Organization. Jiang has more than 30 years' experience working on international trade. He's also served as China's permanent representative to the WTO. China has dethroned Spain, becoming Cuba's largest export market for cigars last year. But industry leaders say these gains can't compensate for falling sales elsewhere, resulting in a 4% decline in global revenue for Cuban cigars. Travel restrictions have been blamed as the industry relies heavily on tourists and duty-free sales. Well, as you heard just a moment ago, it's turning out to be a bumper earnings season. Juliet covering the big results here in Europe. Let's go live to Wall Street and talk to our correspondent, John Terris. John, good to see you. Markets took a bit of a wobble after those comments by the U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. She's backtracked a bit now. What can you tell us?
Yes. Oh, my goodness me. I mean, that's an understatement, the word wobble. We were in terrible straits 24 hours ago here at the New York Stock Exchange, and the big fallers were the big tech stocks. Apple went down to $127 per share, for example. It was up around 136 just a few days before. What happened is that Janet Yellen, who's the Treasury Secretary, said in the course of a speech somewhere that she thought that interest rates in America may have to rise somewhat. That's what she said, rise somewhat, in response to her boss next door at the White House spending all this money to try and reinvigorate the U.S. economy. So down went all those FANG stocks and the software stocks and the cloud stocks and the chip stocks. They were all in negative territory. Technology, you see, is hit very badly by talk of interest rate increases. I think we've done on this program a number of times where the 10-year U.S. government treasury bond, the interest rate spiked above 1.6%, and that hit technology stocks. And so talk of interest rates going up and inflation by the Treasury Secretary herself really rattled things. And so the money came out of techs into things like financials, of course, with rates going up. That benefits banks and so on. Also, the industrials and the material stocks, they can absorb an interest rate hike much more easily than the tech stocks can. Now we come to today, Wednesday morning, a rainy day in Washington and in New York, and Janet Yellen is literally rowing back from what she said yesterday. She said, I was not recommending that the Federal Reserve raise interest rates, and nor was I predicting it. And so here in New York, people are going, phew, thank heavens for that. So today the stocks are all up. We have the Dow up 0.5%. We have the Nasdaq that was so badly hit yesterday ahead by 0.6%. And we have the S&P 500 ahead by 0.5%. But we all know that inflation is out there. We all know that it's coming, and we all know the cure for that is interest rates moving. And so in a way, I think Wall Street is burying its head in the sand a little bit like an ostrich. But anyway, we live to fight another day, and the wobble of yesterday has wobbled the other way. Jamie.
John, let's talk about the automotive sector, because we all know the car industry has had a terrible time during the pandemic, and then this chip shortage. General Motors just posted their results. Are investors happy?
I know. I was listening to the comments about Stellantis just now and the 14% increase, and it's kind of the same here in North America. The car companies have done far better than they expected to. Now, General Motors shares up 4% this hour, and their net profit for the first quarter was $3.3 billion. So that's when everything's done and dusted. They've made $3.3 billion. I like to talk about Mary Barra, who is the CEO of General Motors. I like to do it because she's one of the very few female CEOs that we have in the Fortune 500. And I don't recommend this, but were you to chop her head off, you would see the letters GM going all the way down her body like a stick of rock. She has been with this company since she was an intern, and she's risen all the way to the top. So the team have done very well in this situation. But what is interesting about General Motors is that they said that their guidance was pretty strong for the rest of the year, and that the chip shortage wasn't going to affect them quite so badly as I think everybody had been expected. It was less of an issue. Now, compare that to the Ford Motor Company, whose numbers also beat Wall Street expectations last week, but who said that in the second quarter, their production would be hit by half because of this microchip shortage, and by 10% in the second half of the year. Now, the car companies partly caused this because they phoned up the chip makers and said, don't bother to send us quite so many chips because we won't be selling many cars now because of the COVID thing. And they were wrong. With all this stimulus around, particularly in North America, people have been buying cars, and that's why they've been caught on the hop with not enough microchips. Now, I think they've also got to look into something called just-in-time delivery, which is where the car companies only get the stuff they need on the day they need to make it. They don't keep it at the factories where they make the vehicles. And I think that that's part of the problem here. I suspect that part of this is just-in-time delivery. In other words, General Motors had more microchips available to put in their cars than Ford did. That's a guess. I don't know for certain, but I'm guessing that's what it is.
OK, let's talk hotels, and the Hilton Hotel Group also reporting, I mean, a pretty grim pandemic. And what about that and life beyond?
Well, I was in a Hilton hotel on Sunday, and the car park was full. I can't tell you why I was there, but the car park was full. So I think they see light at the end of the tunnel. Essentially, their shares are down 2.5% now because they have had this big loss. It wasn't unexpected because of COVID-19 curbs in Europe and also in Asia. But I can tell you in North America, our experience is that leisure travel is coming back. Business travel, really not so much. A lot of people are afraid of hotels because of what we've all just lived through. And actually, Airbnb is the leading travel agency at the moment. So, you know, it's going to take time, I think, before the hotel industry really comes back. But in America, we are starting to see reopening now. You know, New York is reopening, if not before, certainly on July the 1st.
John, shares tumbling in the exercise company, Peloton, the exercise bike company. What's happening there?
Yeah, good. I'm glad we got to this. It's a very important story. Peloton, of course, makes that bike. As you know, it's an exercise bike. It has a television basically on the front. They're a company that was formed in 2012, and they've really benefited from the lockdown. They've sold a lot of these bikes, but they've also got a treadmill. Now, the treadmill is really their secondary product, but unfortunately, a child has died, and 70 or more people have received burns and bruises and cuts and just all sorts of injuries. Kids and pets have been sucked under the treadmill, and you can see all this on YouTube and other social media sites. So today, the company has issued a full refund for the treadmill if you want. They've sold 125,000, and crucially, the CEO, John Foley, has said, we made a mistake. We should have cooperated with the authorities sooner than we did. Peloton shares down 15% this hour.
John, good to talk to you. Thanks very much for that. John Terrett there for us live in Wall Street.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, the post-Brexit fishing row escalates. France says it could cut off electricity to the Channel Island of Jersey.
More than 100,000 people in Italy have now died from COVID-19.
The vaccination programme offers some hope for the future, but intensive care units are near capacity.
The Spanish government is hoping to vaccinate over 1 million people by next month.
Living in Germany are struggling with their mental health.
Hungary is supplementing the EU's vaccine rollout, buying doses from Russia and China to speed up the process.
4 million people have tested positive in France.
After a grim winter, the promise of a spring bloom that could mean freedom for millions.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
We can try out the wild and crazy ideas.
Nothing can stop an idea whose time is coming. This idea is coming.
I actually feel quite comfortable in isolation.
We should all be very basic when we're trying to save the world.
Awesome!
We hope it will happen. We have to live in hope.
The agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and me, Juliet Mann. Our top stories. The coronavirus scare at the G7. India pulls out of face-to-face talks in London after 2 of its delegations test positive.
Our other headlines: Brussels denies the EU-China investment deal has been suspended over sanctions and worsening relations with Beijing. Former US President Donald Trump's ban from Facebook and Instagram has been upheld by the tech giant's oversight board. But a review of that decision has been ordered, with Facebook expected to give what's been called a proportionate response within 6 months.
Well, Trump had his account suspended from both platforms in January after his supporters stormed Capitol Hill. Speaking a short time ago, he described the actions of Facebook as a total disgrace. Live to Washington and our correspondent Nina Potts. So, Nina, tell us a little bit more about the ban itself and what it covers.
Well, the key message is that indefinite suspension doesn't work and isn't fair. And in the words of the Oversight Board, they've called this ban indeterminate and standardless. So they've called on Facebook to review the penalty, to rethink it, find a proportionate response over the next 6 months, and basically justify it. So President Trump's, or former President Trump's, accounts remain suspended on Facebook. Technically, his fans and followers can share his post from his own website, brand new website, which was launched just yesterday, called From the Desk of Donald Trump, and they can share his messages to Facebook and Twitter. Twitter, for reference, has continued to ban his account and has no plans to reinstate it, at least until any threat of violence dissipates. The right-wing and conservative media, certainly, and allies of President Trump, former President Trump himself, as we heard there, furious about the upholding of the ban. But there are parameters for Facebook to really come up with a justification. This is essentially a message from the Oversight Board, which is meant to be independent, to say that Facebook can't just make up the rules as it goes along.
But Nina, if Trump has his own website now, why is this so important to Trump? And also, why is it so important to Facebook now?
Well, from Facebook's perspective, this decision really sets a global precedent. All eyes will be on Facebook on how it handles and treats other global leaders around the world, people of influence, going forward. For President Trump and his conservative allies, there is utter fury at the upholding of the ban. They claim this basically adds fuel to the fire, to the argument that the social media giants' bans amount to censorship, and they really want tech giants punished legally for trying to limit free speech. Facebook, it should be said, has faced criticism for years over allegations of abetting political partisanship and for spreading or allowing disinformation and misinformation to spread. Of course, for former President Trump, it was a main vehicle for his fundraising. He enjoyed something like 35 million followers on Facebook, so it was a major tool for his fundraising campaign. And if he's throwing his hat in the ring again for a rerun, then clearly this ban has huge implications. And again, from Facebook's perspective, it still faces criticism even over very recent actions. We saw, for example, with Prime Minister Narendra Modi in India, Facebook essentially hiding or blocking, or accused of hiding and blocking, calls for Prime Minister Modi to resign, and then allowing those posts to resurface once it was caught out. So I think there are big questions for Facebook on its conduct going forward.
Nina, Trump has been giving his response a short while ago. Talk us through what he said.
Well, his statement, as you read there, slammed actually not just Facebook, but also Twitter and Google, the major social media companies, as being a total disgrace, an embarrassment to the country, that they should pay a political price for decisions to keep certain individuals, including himself, off social media. Simultaneously, it's probably worth saying that the Republican Party is also, at a political level within the party, searching for its version of the truth. And we've seen a movement against, or a move against, Liz Cheney, who holds the third highest ranking position in the House for the Republicans, really shunned by her colleagues and hectored by Trump voters, even back on her home turf, for refusing to buy into the former president's claims of election fraud. So simultaneously, at a political level, the Republican Party is also, I think, wrestling with the version of events that it wants to promote, while at the same time slamming social media giants for suppressing their version of the truth.
Nina Potts, thank you very much for the update.
And staying in the United States, the former Minneapolis police officer found guilty of the killing of George Floyd has asked for a retrial. Floyd's death sparked protests across the world. Derek Chauvin was found guilty last month, but his lawyers say he didn't get a fair trial because of alleged misconduct by the prosecution and the jury. He faces 40 years in prison and will be sentenced next month.
Italy has launched a major new offensive against its biggest organised crime group. Law enforcement officials from Germany, Spain and Romania have been recruited in the crackdown on the 'Ndrangheta cartel from Calabria in southern Italy. Investigations are focusing on the group's alleged drug smuggling, with millions of euros of assets seized.
A journalist who disappeared last month in Mali has been kidnapped by the so-called Al-Qaeda North Africa group, according to the French Foreign Ministry. Olivier Dubois is the first French national to be taken hostage by jihadist militants in Mali since 2016. Dubois works for France's Le Point magazine and Libération newspaper.
The deadline for Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu to form a new government has expired, opening the possibility of a new coalition government. The Prime Minister, who's leader of the right-wing Likud party, has been given 28 days to build a working majority, but he's failed to win enough support from opposition groups.
France's President Macron is to lay a wreath at the tomb of Napoleon Bonaparte on the 200th anniversary of his death. France has been divided over the commemorations to mark the event, with some calling for a boycott. As well as leading France to victory in the Revolutionary Wars, its most famous military general also reintroduced slavery in many French overseas colonies.
France has threatened to cut off electricity to the Channel Island of Jersey in a dispute over post-Brexit fishing rights.
It accuses the British dependency of stalling in issuing licences to French boats. Let's talk to our correspondent Ross Cullen. Ross, this is an extraordinary major escalation in this fishing row.
Yes, Jamie, it's growing increasingly ugly. We've heard from the Jersey External Affairs Minister saying that the threat from France to cut off the island's electricity is disproportionate and based on a misunderstanding. Jersey relies on France for about 95% of its electricity needs. And now the island is interesting. It is a self-governing island that relies on London's control when it comes to defence and international affairs, but it runs its own internal affairs. It is not part of the United Kingdom. It has never been part of the European Union, but it has been entangled in this net of discord over fishing rights, quotas, access to each other's waters that have been dominating the Brexit debates. It's all linked to what happened on the 1st of January when the UK definitively left the transition period with the EU. That created a mountain of paperwork, licences, signatures, forms, more documents for French fleets trying to access British waters, something they have been able to do for nearly 50 years. The UK was a member of the European Union for nearly half a century, allowing for deep integration between fishing fleets and fishing stocks. But it's all speaking to the more emotional issue, the larger issue of the fishing industry when it comes to nationalism. And the UK is an island nation. Jersey is one of the Channel Islands. France has a very long coastline, and Jersey has really been caught up in this. We've seen Jersey boats blocked from access to French ports, French fishing fleets stuck in port as well, not able to fish. And so that issue of emotion has really come back into the picture again, despite the fact, though, Jamie, if you look at the actual economic impact of fishing in the UK and the European Union, it's actually relatively small fry.
Yeah, small fry. Ross Cullen, thank you very much indeed for that.
Moving into a new home is always exciting, but for a Dutch couple in the city of Eindhoven, there was also the distinction of being Europe's first inhabitants of a 3D printed house. Catherine Drew reports.
The first occupants of the concrete bungalow will be two retired shopkeepers who admired its undulating walls and sombre grey aesthetics, which designers said were meant to evoke a large boulder. The two-bedroom house was printed in 24 parts in a nearby factory before being assembled. Grooves where the printer shuttled back and forth can be seen clearly on the walls of the 94-square-metre building. Project engineers and contractors involved said the structure represents a leap forward in home construction.
With this small construction behind us, I think a big step has been taken today towards a high-quality construction industry. With this technology, that is to say, digitalisation technology, we have greatly contributed to bringing more versatility, sustainability and health to the construction industry.
Designers say the house, which fully complies with Dutch building standards, is the first of 5 in what they call Project Milestone. The designs are set to become more sophisticated as they build on the knowledge gained from the first 3D printed house in the Netherlands. Catherine Drew, CGTN.
You're watching CGTN live from London. Still ahead, the fear over where your next meal is coming from. Millions pushed into a food crisis worsened by the pandemic.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you. All around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing, and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London. China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
Mari, what would you say is a good question?
Stephen, I'd say it's one where there's always more than one answer.
The Answers Project is a new podcast series from CGTN Europe. With me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge. In each episode, we'll take a complex question.
And with the help of some of the world's foremost experts, shine light on some of the answers. So join us for The Answers Project.
Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. Millions more people live in fear of starvation because of the pandemic, conflict, pre-existing economic shocks and extreme weather. A report by the Global Network Against Food Crises reveals that at least 155 million people faced a lack of food that threatens lives in 2020. That's almost 20 million people more than the previous year. 2 out of 3 people facing food crises last year were in Africa, with almost 100 million people affected. But other conflict-hit countries like Yemen, Afghanistan, Syria and Haiti are among the 10 worst food crisis hotspots last year.
Well, let's get more on this now and talk to Luca Rosso from the Food and Agriculture Organization, who joins us live from Rome. Welcome to the programme. Thank you very much for talking to us. This is a very grim picture, and the outlook is not much better, is it?
No, unfortunately not, but it's not unexpected, because already last year we had quite a number of people in a very difficult situation, and the effect of COVID on this is not a surprise for us.
The pandemic obviously hasn't helped in any part of the world, but there are other factors at play here, aren't there? What else is to blame for these food crises?
The word that comes to my mind is conflict, and conflict. Out of these 155 million people that you mentioned, 100 million live in conflict situation. Very often, it's a toxic mix between conflict, economic problems linked to COVID and climate. So the three things mixed together makes this situation.
The countries facing the worst hunger crises also tragically have the lowest vaccine rates. How worried are you about the impact of a prolonged pandemic on those areas?
No, this is a key point. The point is that let's put it like this: the containment measures of COVID are having an impact on the economics of this country, and particularly the most vulnerable people. And we see this from our numbers. Now, the problem is that we don't know if this situation can survive one more year of a situation like this. It's a matter of vaccine, but it's also a matter of providing the right kind of support to this population.
Well, let's talk about that support. I mean, how do you end this vicious cycle which seemingly has gone on for all of our lives?
Okay, on the one hand, humanitarian assistance remains fundamental. Unless you are able to provide humanitarian assistance to this affected population, and particularly to access this population, because very often they are in conflict situations where they cannot even be accessed by humanitarian assistance. And humanitarian assistance is growing every year. It was 6.2 billion 3 years ago, and it was 7.8 billion last year. But it's not sufficient, and it's not bringing a sustainable solution to this. What we really need is to push for a transformation of the agriculture food system this population lives on, because 70% of the population affected by food crisis are essentially agriculturalists. So I'm coming from FAO, that's quite an obvious answer, but at the same time, I think we really need to invest in agriculture.
When you look at something like the pandemic and the response from the international community, I mean, it's very clear it's been terribly fragmented. Are you optimistic the international community is any more capable of working together on solving the food crisis?
Well, you see, you mentioned at the beginning the Global Network Against Food Crisis, which is a new initiative, is an alliance between a lot of actors, both donors, UN agency, and is really something that aims at coordinating better the efforts. It's clear that situation complex like this cannot be found a solution only by one agency or an actor. So it's very important the coordination among all actors, including, if I may, also peace actors, because unless you are able to bring peace in this context, the solution cannot be found.
Luca Rosso in Rome, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.
Most welcome.
The Red Cross has been part of the global effort to distribute life-saving supplies during the coronavirus crisis. This includes delivering 100,000 vaccines to remote areas. The organisation has a 60-year partnership with Land Rover, which has donated more than 250 vehicles. Paul Barber spoke to Simon Lewis from the Red Cross about the impact the pandemic has had.
Our business as usual, our everyday work has continued as well as having COVID. So, we already, prior to COVID, were responding to an emergency every 4 hours in the United Kingdom. And of course, with COVID, and I've always said this with regards to emergencies generally, that it makes the people that are already vulnerable more vulnerable. So we have been dealing with a lot of people who were already possibly vulnerable before COVID struck. And of course, with isolation, with shortage of food supplies, just as examples, these have been real large issues for us to deal with. So a very different focus, and it's changed month on month as we've all experienced.
And what's the biggest challenge been in reaching the most remote and needy areas?
In the United Kingdom, we have quite rural settings where certainly our partnership with Land Rover has assisted, because with their support, we've had well over 250 vehicles loaned to us, and without those vehicles we certainly wouldn't have been able to meet the needs of as many people as we have, something like 1.5 million people.
What kind of COVID humanitarian issues are you seeing now on the ground?
People not necessarily being willing to be vaccinated. So these are sometimes new communities in the UK, hard to reach communities, and we're working with community groups to try to get to the heart of that issue, to try to encourage everybody to get themselves vaccinated. So that's where we are now. Facets with the COVID-19 pandemic is the fact that it affects everybody, whereas responding to, say, for example, a flood or the after effects of a terrorist event, you're not attending or responding to that incident having also been affected. So that's something that is sometimes forgotten, whereas with COVID, we're all affected in some ways. We all know somebody who may have passed away, or we know family members that are affected, or we're actually isolating ourselves. So that's a bit of a game changer for us.
You've touched on it just there, but I'm wondering, as Head of Emergency Planning and Response at the British Red Cross for almost a decade, how else you think this pandemic measures up against other crises you've dealt with in the past?
There are positives and negatives, I suppose. The big positive is the developmental pieces, like digital solutions to some of the challenges we face, that we actually programmed for the next decade, have been fast forwarded. So we're actually in a far better place now to use real technical solutions, i.e. rostering tools, warning and informing messaging, in a way which we were hoping to do, as I've said, in the next decade, and we're now doing that right now. So that's really helpful.
The headlines again: a coronavirus scare at the G7. India pulls out of face-to-face talks in London after 2 of its delegation test positive.
Brussels denies the EU-China investment deal has been suspended over sanctions worsening and worsening relations with Beijing.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. More on all of our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps such as Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, on YouTube and Dailymotion, as well as cgtn.com and the CGTN app. Thanks for watching. From all of the team here in London, goodbye.
Goodbye.